Join us for our upcoming fundraiser, A Feast for the Senses, at Ardmore Music Hall on September 29th to help HRN expand our table and provide even more resources to the next generation of food storytellers. This is going to be an unforgettable night of flavors, crafted by Best of Philly chefs Randy Rucker and Eli Collins, with sounds curated by Philly-based Spaga featuring Aaron Magner, and conversations inspired by Delicious City Philly host Eli Kulp. You can find tickets at heritageradionetwork.org/feast. And if you can't make it to our fundraiser, please consider donating to support our education programs at heritageradionetwork.org/donate.
Westholme is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
This is What Doesn't Kill You Food Industry Insights. I'm your host, Katie Kiefer. And today we're talking about, guess what, people? We're talking about water. I know I'm like a broken record, but let's face it, we can't actually live without it. So it seems like kind of an important topic. So to that end, today we are welcoming back a guest who's been on at least once, maybe twice, John Rumpler, who is the Clean Water Director and Senior Attorney for an organization called Environment America Research and Policy Center. John directs the Environment America's efforts to protect our rivers, lakes, streams, and drinking water. His areas of expertise include lead and other toxic threats to drinking water, factory farms and agribusiness pollution, algal blooms, fracking, and the Federal Clean Water Act, which is what we're going to talk about today. He previously worked as a staff attorney for Alternatives for Community and Environment and at the Tobacco Control Resource Center. So an all-round good egg, as they say. Welcome, John. Thanks so much for coming back to talk about ephemeral streams today. But before we get into that, can you just remind people about your organization so they can check it out if they want to?
Sure. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, again, I work as the Clean Water Director for Environment America. People can go to our webpage at environmentamerica.org. We are a citizen-supported organization with members across the country in all 50 states.
Wow, fantastic. How old is that organization, John? Like a couple decades, right?
Yeah, I mean, we really, our network of organizations that Environment America is a part of has been around since the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Environment America was not officially incorporated until 2007, but I've been doing work with the network, basically the same advocacy work for clean water, just under a different brand before that time.
Right. So in other words, a long-standing commitment to guaranteeing our water supply.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about, because you were nice enough to send me a press release about this, a recent study conducted by scientists, I think at UMass. I saw one report said UMass, one report said Yale. I couldn't figure out which one it was. But in any case, that recent study showed that up to a whopping 55% of our drinking water as a nation is coming from what are called ephemeral water sources. So let's start by explaining what we mean by an ephemeral water source.
Sure. These are streams that basically are fed by rain. They don't flow unless there's rain, so they come and go. Yeah. But it's incredible how much volume of water in our nation's rivers come from these so-called ephemeral streams.
Right. Incredible. And so therefore, so much of our actual drinking water, in other words, these ephemeral streams recharge our rivers, lakes, and wetlands, right?
Exactly.
With fresh water. And then we draw on those to provide drinking water in households across the country. So let's go back to the way back machine and talk a little bit about the Clean Water Act and how it works to protect our water supply and what it has said in the past about ephemeral streams.
Sure. Look, when our nation came together in 1972 to pass this bedrock environmental law, the Clean Water Act, the law set up some clear goals to make all of our waterways safe for swimming and fishing by 1983, and
Wow.
to end the direct discharge of all pollutants into our waterways by 1985. Now, we've missed those deadlines by quite some time, but the notion of making all of our waterways clean is core to this bipartisan, overwhelmingly supported environmental law. And for most of its existence, the Clean Water Act was assumed by policymakers and most Americans to protect all waterways, because we know that streams and rivers and lakes and bays are all connected, and wetlands too.
Right.
And so it just makes common sense to be protecting all of them. And that's what most people thought to be the case for a very long time.
But for quite a while now, because even during the Obama administration, there was a lot of, how should I say, I don't know what to call it, pushback, or a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy around the definition of waters of the United States, otherwise known as WOTUS. So, this has been a fight for at least a decade plus, and maybe longer. I mean, when did that become? Was it just in the Obama administration that basically agribusiness started pushing back on the notion of keeping those streams and wetlands clean?
Right. It was around the early 2000s that the Farm Bureau and other industries sought litigation as a way to chip away at the power of the Clean Water Act. And to find out why, remember that if a waterway is protected by the Clean Water Act, you have to get a permit that limits how much pollution you can put in there. And if you violate that permit, you can be held under enforcement from citizen suits or EPA or state agencies, and be on the hook for thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for violating the law.
Right.
So, you can pretty quickly see why polluting industries would not want the Clean Water Act to interfere with their profit-making in polluting ways. And that goes for wetlands too. Developers that just want to pave over wetlands, which of course are vital to our ecosystems, if they could chip away at which wetlands are actually protected or not protected by the Clean Water Act, that really would allow them to act with impunity.
Right. And that brings us to the new interpretation of WOTUS via the recent, as in 2023, Supreme Court decision in Sackett versus EPA, which has had a major impact on ephemeral waterways and thus our drinking water. So maybe you could describe what the Sackett case was and how it changes aspects of the Clean Water Act.
Sure. The Sackett case is brought by a couple in Idaho living by a lake that wanted to develop some wetlands that clearly had a connection to that lake. But they didn't want to even bother to apply for a Clean Water Act permit that might mitigate or have some requirements on reducing the damage they might cause. And so the right-wing lawyers at the Pacific Legal Foundation and others picked up the cause of this Idaho couple. And the Supreme Court has had this issue in its sights for some time, so they eagerly took up the case. The phrase you used when you talked about WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, that is literally the phrase in the Clean Water Act to describe the waterways that are protected by the law. Mm-hmm. And again, the most common understanding of waters of the United States would be, if there's water in it and it's in the United States, it's protected, right? I mean, that seems pretty common sense.
That would be my inference, yeah.
And, but the court just completely ignored precedent, completely ignored the common language of the law, and came up with its own ridiculous rule that said, well, if there is not water continuously flowing all the time, and if you cannot tell where the waterway ends or begins in a very clearly demarked kind of way, then the waterway is no longer protected. The practical impact of this completely judge-made, just completely new rule made up by the court, not anywhere in the Clean Water Act, nothing in the Constitution, nothing in existing law. I mean, I just can't emphasize how much this is an act of judicial activism that conservatives often decry, is really what was at stake here in Sackett versus EPA. And as a practical matter, what it means is these ephemeral streams that don't flow year-round, as well as more than half of our nation's wetlands, now likely no longer have protection under our federal Clean Water Act.
Gee whiz. That is just it's just so disturbing and alarming. So now that this has happened, so Sackett says that when things are not contiguous, but water, I know I asked you this later on, but isn't it true that water, in a landscape where you have ephemeral streams or wetlands or both, those are all interconnected, even if it's underground. So, just because there's like, a road in between a wetland and an ephemeral stream, it doesn't mean that they're not contiguous, right? So it's like...
Absolutely. The Supreme Court basically just threw out the scientific evidence and the precedent about waterways being connected. You referenced a case that went to the Supreme Court all the way back in 2006. That was Rapanos, a Michigan landowner that also wanted to pave over some wetlands without getting a permit from EPA. And in that case, the court said, well, you have to at least show some significant nexus or connection between these wetlands and other larger waterways in order to be protected. And lo and behold, because as you point out, Katie, most of our waterways are protected, there were more than 1,000 scientific studies that EPA came up with to support a rule that was passed by the Clean Water Act, a rule that was adopted by the Obama administration in 2015 that we worked very hard to get through, and it basically was called the Clean Water Rule, and it clearly established that all of these connected waterways are protected by the Clean Water Act.
Right.
This Supreme Court, in the Sackett decision, just threw that entire concept out. They just said it doesn't matter if these waterways are connected or not. If there is not a visible surface connection that a landowner or developer can clearly see with their own eyes, then it's just disregarded. It's no longer protected.
Right. So hydrology be damned. In other words, like, the mapping of waterways, which happen underground and above ground, forget about that stuff. So what can we anticipate seeing in our water supply in the wake of this decision? Like, what kinds of pollution, what kinds of damage do you anticipate as an advocate for this, for our water supply?
Well, two things. First of all, our wetlands are like the kidneys of our ecosystem. They absorb pollutants before they can flow downstream to sources of drinking water or places where people go fishing or swimming and so forth. So the more that those wetlands are paved over and degraded and less able to absorb pollutants, we're going to see more pollution flowing into our waters. By the way, these wetlands also provide critical habitat for wildlife.
Absolutely.
And they protect our communities from flooding.
Right.
I mean, in many places, wetlands can hold up to 1 million gallons of floodwater per acre. And with climate change causing even more and more frequent flooding, it just seems crazy that we would allow our last remaining wetlands, because many of them have already been degraded over the history of the United States, that we would allow developers to remove this last natural defense that we have from flooding. It's just insane.
It is
in
insane.
terms of these ephemeral streams, these streams that don't flow all the time are a huge source of drinking water. EPA, back when they did their last national calculation a little more than a decade ago, they estimated that ephemeral streams and a separate set of streams that also don't flow all the time called intermittent streams, And then headwaters, that's where all of our streams come from, where they start. Headwaters, ephemeral streams, and intermittent streams together help provide drinking water to 117 million Americans.
Wow. So yeah, that's significant. Very
Huge.
significant. Yeah. So when this new study came out, which was quite recent, obviously, since you sent me the press release, will states be able to take over? I mean, can states then create their own regulations to protect their own wetlands and ephemeral streams, or are they bound by this, Supreme Court decision in some way?
No, states can absolutely act to protect their wetlands and their streams, and we urge them to do so. There are some states that have passed laws saying, our state regulations cannot be any more stringent than the federal. And so that could be a barrier. But of course, those legislatures could go back and amend that law to allow protection of wetlands and streams.
Right. But, somehow that seems unlikely in the current climate around, profit over people sort of being the trump card. And I say that with a double entendre there, being the trump card that basically guides our policy right now in terms of the federal government, right? I mean, certainly every single one of these Supreme Court decisions that's been handed down in this term, as well as the Sackett decision, has made it clear that what is really important is making money, and what is not important is people's health and well-being. I mean, that's how I interpret this.
Well, what I often think, Katie, is that the most important court in this work is the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
And I happen to believe that here in the United States, even when we see ourselves in our most cynical and divided moments, the vast majority of Americans want clean water.
Yes.
They want enforcement of clean water laws. They want to be able to take their family to the beach and go swimming without getting sick from bacteria. They want to be able to go to their favorite lake or stream without fear of toxic algae that's going to get their pets sick. They want to be able to have safe and clean drinking water coming out of their taps. So the Supreme Court might be in one place. I think the court of public opinion is decidedly ruling in favor of clean water. And so if the public speaks up and tells their state legislators, tells their governors, tells their state agencies, we need stronger protections, I think there's a lot of opportunity for things to move in the right direction in the states. We're already seeing that in a few places.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I mean, I often talk on the show about the difficulty of managing wastewater in the face of these giant, when we talk about agribusiness, for example, in the Corn Belt or the Farm Belt states, and, towns that are no longer able to afford the technology required to process the immense amounts of nitrates and effluent from factory farms and so on. That's where the rubber meets the road. And unfortunately, those states don't seem to be, I'm thinking, of course, specifically of Iowa, but I know Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, they are all having, Kansas, they're all having enormous problems regulating and protecting their water sources. And so it's a real uphill battle, honestly, in my opinion, because even if there's enforcement, which there rarely is, they don't have the technology, the financial means to implement the technology required to actually, filter all that stuff out. So it's a multi-pronged problem that isn't just a legal problem or even political will, but it's also a financial burden on communities where they are really compromised. And drinking bottled water on the regular, they just take it for granted that that's how they have to live. I mean, I did a show probably 10 years ago with some community in Kansas where the entire population of this community had to drink bottled water and cook with bottled water, and taking a shower was sort of like keep your mouth closed and your eyes closed so you don't get near your mouth. I mean, incredible. Anyway, we digress as usual. We're going to take a short break for a sponsored drop. We'll be right back with John Rumpler from Environment America. So please stay tuned. We'll talk more about ephemeral streams. How many do you have in your neighborhood? Check it out.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland guided by their natural ecosystem. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
So, we were talking about the role of wetlands, but in each part of the country, there are different sort of what would I call it? Like different, like in the West, there are ephemeral streams more than there are wetlands. In the, say, Northeast or the mid-Atlantic states, there's more wetlands than ephemeral streams. Am I right about that?
Right. Drier areas tend to have more of these streams that don't run year-round. In some places like New Mexico and Arizona, something upwards of 80 or 90% of communities depend on these streams, at least to some degree, for their drinking water. Yes.
Yeah, so this is a really significant challenge to their water supplies. And in some cases, those are very Republican states. I'm thinking of Texas, for example, which is another state which has, is very water challenged right now. And so what do you think the chances are of Greg Abbott, for example, taking steps to protect their water supplies?
I think that in each state, we're going to have to adapt a strategy to the politics and opportunities that are there. And some places, no question, are going to be harder to get the kinds of policies in place to protect clean water that we want. But I will tell you, in Texas, we have a very strong state affiliate there, Environment Texas. And just about a year ago, we managed to build a bipartisan coalition that put together a $1 billion bond for expanding and maintaining state parks in Texas. So I just mean to say that even when things from the outside look grim and the politics seem daunting, if we are creative in our approaches and we genuinely reach out in a bipartisan way, I'm confident that we can make some progress everywhere. It won't be everything that we need to protect clean water, but we have to move forward in the most pragmatic way and keep building the political support from the public in places like Texas and Iowa and all across the country.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, you're a far more optimistic person than I, but I think it's probably because you've had some success in bringing together those bipartisan coalitions. Because, I mean, I'm thinking about, Iowa is a wholly owned subsidiary of, essentially the corn and hog lobbies, right? So, I mean, these guys, I don't know. Do you follow Chris Jones? Did you read The Swine Republic? I'll send you a link to his book.
Absolutely, one of the best books of this year. I adore Chris Jones. His analysis is so incisive, and hopefully he is starting to build a groundswell of public awareness and support so that we can have the political will for stronger policies in Iowa.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has started a group, and he does seem to be attracting a lot of attention there. I'm sure they'll be
Katie,
firebombing him.
I don't mean to quibble over words, but
No,
I would
please.
say I'm less of a naive optimist and more just a realist, which is to say, we have no choice, right?
Yeah.
For the
Well,
people who
there's
live in
that.
Texas and the people who live in Iowa, we have no choice but to just figure out a smarter strategy for winning at least some changes to reduce this pollution to some degree. What other choice do we have? We owe it to our citizen members on the ground in those states, as well as other members of the public, to defend clean water the best we can. Are we going to get stronger policies in places like Colorado and Maryland and New York? I hope so.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do in the heartland of industrial agribusiness.
No, I would agree with you there. And I certainly, I would never use the word naive, but I think optimism, perhaps, okay. I'm so, I've spent so much time looking into the policies in states like Iowa, especially, that really seem to be completely indifferent to the needs of the population and only interested in the profitability of those types of agriculture, whether it's animal or monocropping corn and soy. So it's a really tough row for the people of Iowa to hoe, and that's true in many of the states where they have a high concentration of industrial agribusiness going on. But you've been talking about development a lot, John, and I wanted to explore that a little bit because I never think about things through the lens of development. I only look at the agricultural impacts. And so I wondered if you could expand a little bit on how does a developer, for example, get away with getting a permit? I mean, I guess Sackett is going to make this much easier for any developer to just say, well, I don't see it connected to a stream, so I'm just going to go right ahead. I don't need a permit, and I don't need to ask anyone's permission, and I don't care what happens to the drinking water. But not having available drinking water for a development is kind of a serious problem too, right?
It sure is. Yeah, it's extremely short-sighted, but all too often we are seeing it. And this is even before Sackett, we were seeing developers riding roughshod over wetlands and contributing to suburban sprawl and degrading our watersheds, right?
Yeah.
That we all depend on. I mean, one of these days, people are going to figure out that we can't drink money, right?
Yeah. Well, we can always try, but I'll drink just about anything myself. Anyway, but WOTUS has long been a target of multiple industries. So besides the development and besides agribusiness, there are a lot of other industries that have a vested interest in seeing and having seen Sackett through the Supreme Court decision.
Sure. Yeah,
Like, what are some of those?
The Farm Bureau definitely has been a prominent opponent of the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. The home builders absolutely have been right up there, but also the mining industry, the
Right.
Chamber of Commerce, many different industrial lobbying groups have weighed in to try to chip away at the protections of the Clean Water Act.
I find that just astonishing. Talk about naive. That's me. So with Sackett, I mean, the other ruling, which people may be more aware of because it happened just recently, is the Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. And so between Sackett and the ruling in Chevron, which perhaps you could explain to listeners exactly what that ruling does for polluters and people who aren't too worried about preserving our clean water supplies. First tell us what is Chevron and how that dovetails with Sackett. And then the second part of my usual multi-part question, and I apologize, what are the mechanisms that remain? I mean, how can we, these are both very important decisions that will have a very long-term impact on,
Sure.
Among other things, our clean drinking water.
So the Supreme Court issued a more recent decision just in the last month or so,
Yeah.
overruling a 40-year precedent known as the Chevron Doctrine. So let's get into what that Chevron Doctrine is, why it
Yes,
matters, and how this court case did away with it. Basically, ironically, it was in 1984 that one of our allies in the environmental community, Natural Resources Defense Council, brought a case under the Clean Air Act to compel the Reagan administration to regulate industrial sources of air pollution. NRDC said, look, if you look at the Clean Air Act, the way we read the language, it clearly requires the reining in of this industrial pollution. And the Supreme Court at that time said, not necessarily so. We are going to defer to the EPA as the agency charged with implementing the Clean Air Act. And if their interpretation of the statutory language is reasonable, then we're going to let it stand. And if EPA has said that this Clean Air Act language does not require them to do the industrial air pollution regulation that NRDC wants, well, that's a reasonable interpretation, and we're going to let the agency do that.
Right.
That precedent was huge because it now meant that not just EPA, but the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FDA, the Department of Interior, virtually every federal agency that you could imagine could actually take its expertise to interpret the laws that Congress charged it to implement. And let's remember, Congress is in no position to micromanage and anticipate every single needed regulation to protect clean air, clean water, food safety, financial fraud, et cetera, drug safety, everything. Right. Instead, what Congress does is passes these broad laws like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the Food Safety and Drug Act or something like that, and says we are charging these agencies with a broad mandate. So that's why Chevron makes, that doctrine makes sense, that you then want to give these agencies latitude to reasonably interpret the law. Now, Chevron, the doctrine never just allowed the agencies to do whatever they want. I mean, if they came out with something that was completely untethered to the statute, conflicted with the plain language, the courts would rightfully intervene and say, you can't do that, or you must do this thing that this law passed by Congress allows. But basically was giving some latitude to agencies to do what Congress probably intended, which was give them the latitude to anticipate threats that Congress could not possibly anticipate in every single instance, and to adopt protections for the public. So in this most recent case that actually involved fisheries regulation, the agency NOAA and the Department of Commerce that regulates fisheries came out with a rule that basically said, hey, if we have to have on-ship inspectors to make sure that fisheries are complying with fish management regulations, we want the operators of these boats to pay for at least some of the cost of having those observers on board. Right. And the fishing industry got all bent out of shape. And said,
they did.
The statute passed by Congress doesn't allow you to implement a rule that imposes a fee. This is like a new tax on us, et cetera, et cetera. And the court saw this as an opportunity. They had been looking for a case for a long time to just destroy this Chevron deference doctrine. And that's exactly what they did in the Loper case that recently came before the court. They said, we are doing away with this 40-year precedent of giving agencies latitude and using their expertise to figure out where regulations are needed, even if Congress could not perfectly anticipate that 20 or 30 years ago when they passed a law.
Right.
So that's basically what that's about. What does that mean for current protections and future protections? Well, in terms of current protections, I think we have to wait and see. The court said in its decision that prior rulings that rejected challenges to regulations based on, this Chevron question, that the court was not going to overrule those again, that would be precedent that would be respected, and those regulations that were upheld in the first place, the court is not going to now overrule those or entertain efforts to overrule those. We will see whether the court actually adheres to that line or language in their decision where they are attempting to assure the public, hey, no big deal here, no big deal. We're not going to be upsetting thousands of regulations that have been passed since 1984. Don't worry, don't worry.
Right.
But at the same time, it's unclear exactly how broadly that reassurance is going to be applied. Time will tell.
Right.
In terms of future regulations, I think the problem now is that every federal agency is going to be looking over their shoulder and saying, if this regulation was not literally explicitly ordered by Congress, we're going to wind up in court.
Jesus.
And that's just going to make it much less likely for our federal government to be able to respond to new and emerging threats to the environment and public health and other public concerns.
Right.
There is one silver lining that I can get to in a minute.
Good. Go for it.
The silver lining of the Loper case and turning over the Chevron deference doctrine is this. If we wind up with an administration that is hostile to the environment and an EPA that tries to rip up regulations that are actually directly mandated by Congress, they too will be open to a challenge. And if the court is actually consistent with what it just said in the Loper case, then the court should be overruling those agencies and saying, we're not going to give you deference, whether that's because you're going stronger than what we think Congress wanted, or if you're trying to go weaker than what we think Congress wanted, we are going to enforce the law as we, the court, see it. And hopefully, again, maybe I am being naive here. You will see opportunities where the court steps in and says, yes, we are no longer deferring to the agency. The most reasonable interpretation of the statute demands this strong protection that's been on the books for years. And no, this pro-polluter EPA in some hypothetical future administration cannot just run roughshod over those protections. So that's the silver lining.
Okay, I'll take your word for it on that.
Again, time will tell if this court is actually consistent with what it said it intended in this ruling, or if they find all kinds of ad hoc rationalizations to keep siding with polluters regardless of the judicial doctrine.
Right.
We will see.
We will see. Well, let's turn our attention to the good news, which is the Biden administration has implemented, or I guess initiated, something called America the Beautiful Freshwater Challenge. What is that all about?
Sure. So in the wake of the Sackett decision stripping away protection of the Clean Water Act for wetlands and many of these streams, as we were talking about, many environmental groups like Environment America and several of our allies came to the administration and said, well, what else can we do together? How else can we work together to protect clean water? And what the Biden administration has come up with as one measure is creating a voluntary partnership for local governments and states and nonprofits to join together to protect 8 million acres of wetlands and 100,000 miles of rivers and streams. So it's a voluntary program, not a regulatory one. It does not rely on the Clean Water Act. It relies on other authority in the federal government, but primarily will be successful because state and local governments choose to sign up and engage in this partnership.
Right. And I know you wanted to tell people that this is the 10th anniversary of the Lake Erie cyanoalgae or toxic algae bloom, which you would think that would make the contiguous states around Lake Erie pretty keen to get into that partnership, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I mean, Lake Erie is a real national treasure. It supplies drinking water to millions. It's vital for recreation and fishing and so many other things. And yet, because of the flow of phosphorus, particularly from industrialized agribusiness and factory farms, we are seeing these toxic algal outbreaks happening virtually every summer in Western Lake Erie. And this is, as you say, the 10th anniversary of when that particularly virulent strain of toxic algae known as cyanobacteria got into the drinking water supply of the whole city of Toledo. So we don't want that to happen in Lake Erie ever again. We don't want to have that happen anywhere in the United States again. So we need to redouble our efforts to strengthen clean water protections, including wetlands and streams, but also, of course, directly reining in pollution from factory farms.
Absolutely. So, John, I think we're just about out of time here because I know Armin has to get going on his next show in a few minutes. Tell people how they can learn more about this from your organization and others. How can they respond to the threat to their drinking water supplies? Is it writing your local legislator? Is it, joining an advocacy group? What are our best options?
It's going to vary from state to state, but I will say that Environment America has state affiliates in 30 states across the country.
Great.
So just go to environmentamerica.org and find your state affiliate, and we'll figure out ways that you can plug in to ensure clean and safe water in your community.
I mean, at the very least, John, it's a matter of education, right? I mean, it's really about letting people know what's happening as much as anything else. Because as you said, in the court of public opinion, everybody wants clean drinking water. So
absolutely.
So it's
absolutely.
It's time for citizens to step up.
Yes, citizens to step up in terms of their own behaviors in the marketplace, their choices about food, their choices about lawn fertilizer, contacting their local government about protecting local wetlands and stopping sprawl that's going to pave over these streams and wetlands, contacting their state legislators about broader policies to rein in industrial polluters and factory farms. There's so much that we can do. But you're right that it starts with public awareness. And that's why I'm so grateful to be on your show today. It's a terrific way to make sure that people have the facts about clean water.
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for joining me today. And we'll have you back soon to talk about some of the other issues that confront us in terms of managing effluent and keeping our water supplies safe for fun and for life. So I really appreciate the work you do and your time with me today. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Katie.
And thanks, as always, to my sponsors for supporting this network. And thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll see you next time. So long for now. What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights, is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.